Walk down any street in any old city, London, New York, Boston, Paris, Prague. You'll see something that nobody questions anymore because it's so common we've stopped noticing it's impossible. Windows at ground level. But not basement windows. Look closer. These are full-sized windows with elaborate stone frames, stained glass, ornamental carvings, architectural details that cost serious money. The kind of craftsmanship you put on main floors, not basements. And next to them, doors. Grand doors, decorative entrances with carved lintels and expensive hardware. Except these doors don't open to the street anymore. They open 3 meters below the sidewalk. You have to descend stairs to reach them. Stairs that go down from modern street level to what was obviously once the ground floor. This isn't limited to a few buildings. It's everywhere. Entire city blocks, entire districts. In some cities, the entire historic center shows this pattern. First floors that are now basements. Main, entrances that are now subterranean. Ground-level architecture that's now underground. The official explanation is simple. Over centuries, cities gradually raised their street levels. They paved over old streets, building up layers, and eventually the ground rose high enough that first floors became basements. It's called raising the street grade, and it's presented as a normal part of urban development. Except that explanation dissolves the moment you think about what it actually requires. To raise a street by 4 meters, you don't just pile dirt on top and call it done. You have to raise every intersection, every cross street, every alley. You have to reconstruct the entire sewer system at the new elevation. Every water main needs relocation. Gas lines, utility infrastructure. You have to build retaining walls to hold back the added earth. You need new staircases and access points for every building. You have to coordinate with thousands of property owners to modify their structures. This is one of the most expensive, complex, time-consuming infrastructure projects imaginable. It would take decades. It would dominate city budgets. It would generate mountains of paperwork. Permits, contracts, complaints from businesses losing their ground floors, newspaper articles about the massive construction disrupting commerce for years. And we're supposed to believe that every major city in the Northern Hemisphere did this simultaneously, between 1800 and 1850, without leaving any significant documentation of the process. No budget records for this massive undertaking, no project timelines, no contemporary accounts of the decade-long construction that should have paralyzed urban life. The historical record is essentially silent about what should have been the largest civil engineering project of the 19th century. What does exist is the physical evidence, the buried doorways, the subterranean windows, the first floors that became basements, and most importantly, the layer itself. In 1939, during construction of Chicago's subway system, workers documented their excavation findings in routine engineering reports. Between the 1850s street level and the modern street surface, they found something unexpected. Not decades of compacted pavement and construction debris gradually accumulated. Instead, they discovered a relatively uniform layer of fine sediment mixed with organic material. The composition suggested rapid deposition, not gradual accumulation over time. Similar findings emerged from excavations in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The layer between original street level and modern street level displayed characteristics inconsistent with slow urban buildup. Uniform composition across large areas, minimal stratification, evidence of waterborne deposition rather than dry accumulation. An engineer working on the Chicago project noted in his report, though the observation didn't make it into official summaries. The burial layer shows characteristics more consistent with flood deposit than with gradual urban development. The uniformity suggests single-event deposition rather than century-long accumulation. That observation was filed away and forgotten because it implied something impossible, something that would require rewriting accepted history. It implied that the burial wasn't gradual, it was sudden, catastrophic, and it happened everywhere at once. Look at excavation photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s, when cities were digging for subway systems and modern utilities. Image after image shows the same thing, a clear boundary layer. Below it, the original street surface and building foundations. Above it, the modern city. And between them, that uniform deposit of sediment that shouldn't be there if streets were gradually raised through intentional construction. St. Petersburg shows the same pattern. Excavations beneath the city reveal original ground levels buried 4 meters below modern streets. Moscow has churches where the main entrance is now at basement level, requiring visitors to descend stairs to reach doors that were once at street grade. Prague's old town sits on top of an earlier version of itself, with medieval streets running 3 meters below the current surface. Istanbul, Vienna, Amsterdam, Copenhagen. Every major European city with significant pre-1900 architecture shows evidence of burial. The depth is remarkably consistent, 3 to 5 meters. The composition of the burial layer is similar across vast distances, and the timing, based on architectural records of when buildings were restored or rebuilt, clusters tightly around the period from 1820 to 1850. This isn't gradual urban development. This is recovery from catastrophe. And there's more evidence, hiding in plain sight in photographs from the 1860s and 1870s, early photography, before extensive restorations of the late 19th century. These images show something that makes no sense if we accept the official timeline. Buildings officially constructed in the 1840s and 1850s, photographed in the 1860s, already show signs of water damage. Not minor weathering, significant damage. Mud staining on stone walls at heights of 2 to 3 meters above ground level. Erosion patterns consistent with submersion. Mineral deposits left by standing water. A photograph from Boston, dated 1867, shows a commercial building officially constructed in 1855, 12 years old. But the stone facade shows water staining reaching well above street level. The pattern is unmistakable to anyone who's seen flood damage. This building was submerged, not by a brief flood that would leave staining at street level, by sustained submersion that reached the second floor, unless the building wasn't constructed in 1855, unless it was excavated in 1855. Dug out from layers of dried mud that had buried it, cleaned, repaired, and then documented as new construction, because admitting it was old. Construction would require explaining where it came from and what buried it. This pattern repeats across hundreds of photographs from the period. Buildings officially dated to the mid-1800s, showing damage patterns consistent with having been submerged and then dried out. It's visible in the stonework if you know what to look for. Water, erosion, mineral staining. Sediment deposits in decorative carvings that would take decades or centuries to accumulate naturally, but appear in photographs of recently constructed buildings. The buildings weren't new. They were recovered, excavated from burial, restored to function, and then claimed as contemporary construction because the alternative explanation was unacceptable, which raises the obvious question: if these buildings weren't built in the 1800s, when were they built? And by whom? Look at the architecture itself. Really look at it. The buildings constructed in the early to mid-1800s demonstrate engineering and artistic sophistication that seems impossible for the technology supposedly available at the time. The United States Capitol. Construction officially began in 1793. The building demonstrates precision stonework, massive scale, and architectural complexity that modern engineers admit would be challenging even with current technology. It was completed in 1826, though construction continued in phases through the 1860s. But the core structure, the fundamental architecture, was supposedly created by a nation that had just fought a revolution, that had no established architectural tradition, that was still primarily agricultural. The scale alone defies belief. The rotunda is 96 feet in diameter. The dome weighs approximately 4,500 tons. The precision required to construct a self-supporting dome of that size using 1790s technology is extraordinary. Modern structural engineers have analyzed the Capitol dome and concluded that the construction techniques required knowledge of engineering principles that supposedly weren't formalized until later in the 19th century. And it's not alone. The same period sees construction of similarly massive, sophisticated structures across multiple continents. The Royal Palace in Madrid, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, all built between 1750 and 1850. All demonstrating identical architectural principles, all sharing the same neoclassical style with remarkable consistency. Here's what makes this impossible according to the official timeline. These structures were built before global communication networks existed, before photography could widely share architectural designs, before architects could easily travel between continents to coordinate styles. Yet buildings in St. Petersburg, Washington, D.C., Buenos Aires, and Melbourne show not just similar styles, but identical proportions, identical construction techniques, identical decorative elements. The official explanation is parallel development. Different cultures independently arrived at the same architectural solutions because these solutions are optimal. Except that explanation fails when you examine the details. These aren't similar buildings. They're variations on a single architectural language. A unified design system applied globally. It's as if all these different architects were working from the same source material, following the same guidelines, building according to standards set by a single civilization. A civilization that doesn't appear in our history books, but does appear on old maps. Pull up maps from the 1600s and early 1700s. European cartography from this period. You'll find something that later maps erase, an empire called Great Tartary, or sometimes just Tartaria. It's not small, it's not a footnote. On maps from this period, Tartaria covers most of Asia. The territory extends from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia to the borders of China, Persia, and India. This isn't obscure. These are mainstream European atlases. Dutch, French, English, German cartographers all include Tartaria. They mark major cities within its borders. They note it as a significant political entity. Some maps show subdivisions: Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. And then, around 1800, it starts disappearing from maps. By 1850, it's gone entirely, replaced by the Russian Empire, China, and various Central Asian territories. The massive empire that appeared on every map for 2 centuries simply vanishes from cartography. No war of conquest is recorded that would explain Russia absorbing this territory. No political dissolution is documented. No explanation is provided for how an empire covering millions of square kilometers ceased to exist. It's just gone from the maps, erased, as if it never was. Except the buildings are still there. The architectural evidence of a unified civilization with consistent building styles across continental distances. The infrastructure suggesting coordination on a scale that shouldn't have been possible for scattered, independent nations. The evidence suggests that Tartaria wasn't myth. It was real. A global or near-global empire with advanced architecture, sophisticated engineering, and unified culture. And something happened to it. Something catastrophic enough to bury its cities under meters of mud and require survivors to excavate and rebuild. Something that happened around 1816. The year 1816 is known in history as the year without a summer. The official explanation attributes this to the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April 1815. The volcanic eruption was massive, one of the largest in recorded history. Ash and sulfur dioxide entered the stratosphere, blocking sunlight globally and causing worldwide temperature drops. Except the pattern of impact doesn't match what you'd expect from an Indonesian eruption. If Tambora was the primary cause, the southern hemisphere and equatorial regions should have been most severely affected. They're closest to the eruption site, but they weren't. The most severe impacts occurred in Europe and North America. Snow fell in New England in June. Crops failed completely across Europe. Famine spread through France and Germany. China reported devastating harvest failures. The climate disruption was most severe in the northern hemisphere, despite the eruption occurring in the southern hemisphere. And contemporary accounts describe something stranger than volcanic ash. A British naval officer stationed in the North Atlantic wrote in his log in July 1816, "The sky maintains a peculiar quality, not merely dark but dense, as if filled with suspended material of unusual character. The sea itself appears different, thicker, and when it rains, the water carries sediment that stains everything it touches." A German farmer recorded in August 1816, "The rain is not clean. It carries earth. When it falls on cloth or paper, it leaves brown, stains that will not wash out. The fields are covered not just with water, but with mud that fell from the sky." These aren't descriptions of volcanic ash. Volcanic ash is fine, powdery, and light-colored. These accounts describe sediment, dirt, material that's heavier than ash, that arrives mixed with rain, that deposits in layers rather than settling as dust. Chinese records from the period describe the Great Deluge of mud affecting multiple provinces. Japanese sources mention earth falling from the sky mixed with rain. European chronicles document floods during this period that were unusual in character. Multiple accounts use phrases like "more mud than water," or "floods that left deposits of unusual depth." Look at the geological record from this period. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve atmospheric composition data. The layers corresponding to 1815-1820 show anomalies. not just volcanic ash signatures. The cores show concentrations of terrestrial sediment, particles, pulverized earth material. The composition suggests multiple source regions, not a single volcanic eruption. A 2003 study of these ice cores, published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, noted, "The sediment loading in the 1816 to 1820 ice layers presents a distribution pattern inconsistent with single-source volcanic deposition. The material composition suggests widespread crustal disruption, or, alternatively, a cometary impact event that generated global ejecta distribution." That phrase, global ejecta distribution, is key. Whatever happened in 1815 to 1816 put enormous amounts of pulverized earth material into the atmosphere. This material then circulated globally before precipitating out over the following years. And when it came down mixed with rain. Mud flows, not clean water, but sediment-laden precipitation that accumulated in low-lying areas. The mechanics would work like this: a massive event, possibly a comet impact, possibly multiple simultaneous, volcanic eruptions, possibly some other catastrophic geological event, throws millions of tons of pulverized earth into the upper atmosphere. This material circulates in the jet stream, spreading globally. Over months and years, it precipitates out. Mixed with rain, it falls as muddy precipitation. In areas with poor drainage or low elevation, it accumulates. Rivers clog with sediment, valleys fill with mud, and cities built in these areas find their ground floors buried under layers of deposited material. 3 to 5 meters of accumulation. Deposited over a span of 5 to 10 years, fast enough that it overwhelmed drainage systems, slow enough that it didn't appear as a single catastrophic flood, but as years of unusually muddy conditions. And then it stopped. The material in the atmosphere settled out. Clean rain returned, but the damage was done. Ground levels had risen, buildings were buried, infrastructure was destroyed, and populations had been devastated by the years of crop failure that accompanied the atmospheric disruption. Which brings us to the next mystery: the population crisis. Look at census data from the early 1800s. The numbers tell an impossible story. New York City in 1800, approximately 60,000 people. By 1850, $15,000. That's an increase of 758% in 50 years. London grew from 1 million to 2.7 million in the same period, a 170% increase. Paris went from 550,000 to 1.3 million. Moscow from 250,000 to 365,000. These aren't normal growth rates for pre-industrial cities. Population growth in this era typically ran at 1 to 2% annually. The rates we're seeing suggest growth of 5 to 8% annually, sustained over decades. That's not growth, that's repopulation. And there are anomalies in the demographic data that official historians don't discuss. Census records from the 1850s contain curious notes. An 1857 census report from New York buried in municipal archives includes this observation: the unusual age distribution of the current population presents challenges for demographic modeling. The absence of middle-aged residents in proportions expected for a naturally growing population suggests either significant recent immigration of young families, or, alternatively, a recent population establishment following a period of absence. That phrase, population establishment following a period of absence. Census officials in 1857 were documenting something they couldn't quite explain. The age distribution didn't make sense. Certain cohorts were missing. It was as if an entire generation had been removed and the population was being rebuilt from younger groups. And then there's the orphan crisis. Between 1854 and 1929, the orphan train movement transported an estimated 250,000 children from eastern cities to rural areas for adoption. The official explanation frames this as a response to urban poverty and overcrowding. Charitable organizations rescuing children from terrible conditions in city slums. But read the primary source documents. Many of these children had no verifiable family history, not because their parents were dead or had abandoned them, but because the children themselves had no memory of parents, no knowledge of their origins. Social worker Charles Loring Brace, who founded the Children's Aid Society that organized many of these orphan trains, wrote in 1859, "A significant proportion of the children in our care cannot provide information about their parentage. When questioned, many seem genuinely confused, as if they have no memory of family. Others provide answers that make no sense, describing places that do not exist or events that could not have occurred." These weren't traditional orphans who had lost parents to disease or accident. These were children without pasts, without origin stories, appearing in cities during the decades following the catastrophe, with no explanation for where they came from. The pattern extends beyond America. London, Paris, Berlin, and Moscow all reported similar phenomena during the same period. Unexplained numbers of children without family histories, orphanages overwhelmed, charitable institutions struggling to process children who had seemingly appeared from nowhere. If the mud flood devastated populations, if the years of crop failure created famine conditions, if entire regions were disrupted by the burial of infrastructure, then what you'd expect to see is exactly what the historical record shows. Population collapse followed by rapid repopulation. Demographic anomalies as survivor populations rebuilt, and generations of children without clear family histories because the social structures that would have maintained those records had been destroyed. And you'd expect something else. A systematic effort to erase evidence of what had happened, to rewrite the history, to create a new narrative that didn't include global catastrophe. Which is exactly what we find. Between 1800 and 1880, there's an extraordinary concentration of major fires destroying libraries, archives, and historical records. Not random accidents scattered across time, a cluster of destruction specifically targeting repositories of historical documentation. 1814, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. burns, destroying thousands of documents, including many original colonial records. 1824, Brazil's Imperial Library suffers a massive fire. 1834, the Palace of Westminster burns in London, destroying centuries of parliamentary records and historical documents. The 1850s through 1870s see waves of library fires across Europe and America. Major archive repositories in multiple countries experience accidental fires during this specific period. The official explanation for each fire is usually carelessness. A candle knocked over, a chimney fire that spread, accidents, but the clustering is remarkable. The percentage of major archival institutions experiencing catastrophic fires during the 60-year period is orders of magnitude higher than the baseline fire rate for institutional buildings. And after each fire, when institutions rebuild their collections, something subtle happens. The new histories written to replace lost documents consistently downplay or eliminate references to Tartaria. Maps are redrawn. The Great Tartary that appeared on every atlas from the 1600s through the 1700s simply vanishes from post-1850 cartography. It's not that earlier maps were wrong and later maps corrected errors. The geographical features are the same. The cities remain. But the political entity called Tartaria is erased. The territory is reassigned to the Russian Empire, to China, to smaller states, as if an empire that had existed for centuries in cartographic records simply never was. Look at the timeline. Catastrophic event in 1816, years of muddy conditions from 1816-1820, widespread burial of first floors, population collapse, repopulation during 1820-1850, architectural construction boom that's actually excavation and restoration, cluster of archival fires destroying historical records, rewriting of maps to remove Tartaria, creation of new historical narrative that denies the existence of a previous global empire. It's not random, it's systematic. The evidence of what existed before the catastrophe was deliberately suppressed, not through conspiracy in the sense of secret meetings and hidden agendas, but through the practical necessity of survivors creating a new social order and a new history that explained their present without reference to a past they could barely remember and didn't fully understand. Because here's what makes this most disturbing. The people who excavated the cities and restored the buildings may not have known who built them originally. If the catastrophe killed most of the population, if the survivors were largely from rural areas or from groups that weren't the primary builders and administrators of urban civilization, they would find themselves inheriting cities they didn't create. They would excavate magnificent structures without knowing their original purpose. They would restore buildings without understanding the full, sophisticated systems those buildings were part of. They would occupy an empire's remains without comprehending the empire itself. And when they wrote their histories, when they created their maps, when they explained their world to their children, they would tell stories that made sense based on what they could see and understand. They would claim to have built what they had actually found. They would describe as their achievements what were actually the achievements of whoever came before, not out of malice, out of ignorance and necessity. The past was gone. The present needed explanation, so they created explanations that worked even if those explanations bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. And now, 200 years later, We're left with the physical evidence they couldn't erase because it was too big, too widespread, too embedded in the landscape itself. The buried first floors that are still there, visible in every old city. The uniform sediment layer that every deep excavation reveals. The architectural consistency across continental distances that suggests unified civilization, not independent development. The maps that once showed Tartaria before that empire was erased from cartography. The demographic anomalies that suggest population replacement, not growth. The cluster of archival fires that destroyed evidence at precisely the time when that evidence would have contradicted the new historical narrative. All of it sitting in plain sight, not hidden, just reinterpreted, explained away. Dismissed as normal urban development, as parallel architectural evolution, as coincidence and natural variation. But the pattern is too consistent, the evidence too widespread, the timeline too compressed, and once you see it, once you really look at those ground-level windows with their expensive stonework and ornamental details, once you understand that those aren't basement windows but buried first-floor windows, the official explanation stops making sense. You don't gradually raise every street in every major city by 4 meters without leaving extensive documentation of the process. You don't develop identical architecture on 5 continents without global coordination. You don't lose an empire the size of Tartaria from maps without explanation. You don't get population explosions of 700% in 50 years through natural growth. You don't have 250,000 children appearing without family histories through normal orphan production. Each piece individually might be explainable through special pleading and careful interpretation, but all of them together, happening in the same short period, concentrated in the same geographic region, creating the same physical evidence pattern, that's not coincidence. That's the signature of a global event. A catastrophe that buried one version of civilization and forced survivors to excavate and rebuild. The mud flood happened. The evidence is literally under your feet. Walk down any street in any old city. Look at the windows at ground level. Look at the doors that descend below the sidewalk. Look at the basements, with architecture too elaborate for basements. Look at the water, staining on stone walls of buildings supposedly built after the flood. Look at the sediment layers in any deep excavation. It's all there. Visible, physical, irrefutable. The mystery isn't what happened. The physical evidence answers that question clearly. Cities were buried under meters of mud deposited over several years following a catastrophic atmospheric event around 1816. A previously unified or coordinated civilization, documented in maps as Tartaria, was devastated. Survivors excavated and repopulated the cities, claiming the architecture as their own because they didn't remember or didn't know who built it originally. The mystery is why the evidence is dismissed, why the pattern is ignored, why the official history insists on explanations that require ignoring the physical reality in front of us. Perhaps because accepting what the evidence shows means accepting that human civilization isn't on a linear path of constant progress, that we've been more advanced before, that we lost that advancement, that everything we take as permanent and secure can be destroyed by events beyond our control or prediction. That's an uncomfortable truth. Easier to say that basement windows were always basement windows, that streets were gradually raised through normal urban development, that the similarities in global architecture are coincidence, that population explosions are just energetic growth, that Tartaria never really existed despite appearing on maps for 200 years. Easier to maintain comfortable lies than confront uncomfortable evidence. But the evidence remains. Buried first floors in every old city, uniform sediment layers in every deep excavation, architectural consistency suggesting unified civilization, demographic data suggesting repopulation after collapse, maps that were redrawn to erase an empire, a cluster of suspicious fires destroying archives during the crucial period when those archives would have documented what actually happened. The lost empire isn't lost. It's buried. And the mud flood isn't mystery. It's documented catastrophe that's been reinterpreted as normal weather and gradual urban development. The evidence is everywhere. You just have to be willing to look down.